Hello and welcome back to the High Ground podcast, High Ground Conversations. Haven't quite decided how I'm going to name this, but we'll fix that in post. Doesn't matter. Anyways, I have an awesome guest. I have Nick here with me, and if you want to start by introducing yourself to the good people, where they can find you, and all that jazz.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like you said, my name is Nick. I have been a part of and connected to several different Star Wars podcasts. I started Podcast of the Whills in 2017 with a good buddy of mine. We call it the podcast that treats Star Wars like a sacred text. Spent a lot of time doing deep dives into the original trilogy movies, kind of working our way through the sequels. We borrowed the idea from a podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, where they took the Harry Potter books and essentially treated them. We kind of said it was like if you had a Bible study, but instead of the Bible, you used Star Wars. So we were going through, pulling out the themes, breaking it down into segments, just, doing what all Star Wars nerds like to do, nerding out and digging deep. When the pandemic hit, my partner had to step away. I wanted to continue and kind of veered into the live stream situation, live shows, live audience, had guests most Sunday nights. Started kind of tying in cocktails, just kind of became a whole different, conversation. Through the course of that, met a ton of people in the Star Wars podcasting space, yourself included. And then along the way, met my friend Pete Fletzer from around the galaxy. He and I have teamed up over the last couple of years. We formed the SSW network. Now he and I host on most every Thursday night, what we call ATG Live. We also still do Around the Galaxy, which is kind of the longer form interview podcasts. What else? We do Podathon, which is our charity event every year. You guys were a part of that this year, which was a huge event. Over the course of the last 4 years, we have been able to raise over $30,000 for the Make-A-Wish Foundation, all built on the strength of the Star Wars fan community and podcasters coming together to spend a day, talking about the thing we love, which is Star Wars, while raising money for the Make-A-Wish Foundation, which is a very worthy cause. All of that to say, I have too many Star Wars hobbies, and that's aside from being a full-time dad, husband, guy who works a full-time real job, as I call it. So there's a lot going on. But if you know me, it's probably from Podcast of the Whills or possibly Around the Galaxy.
That's awesome. That's a lot of stuff. Although I'm starting to catch up with the amount of different things I'm
just
involved
happens.
in.
All of a sudden you look up, you're like, sure, I'll make this other idea. Or, when you're a creative person, you go, ooh, I want to try this. And, I've gone through stints guesting with our friends over at Shooting the Poodoo. I've gone through, phases. I had another friend that lives in the state of Alabama where I live who had a movie podcast. And they would do weekly TV show recaps, and they needed a Star Wars expert every time Star Wars shows were on. So there was a point where I think I was doing things maybe 4 nights a week, and my wife said, this has to stop. There has to be a line somewhere. So had to make some adjustments along the way, but that's okay.
Awesome. By the way, I've always been a big fan of the shill shirts. It's just the best.
Yep.
It's just the best design.
It's one of our
I need to get
classic
one.
faves.
Yeah, because if you like things, you're a shill, obviously.
That's right. If you like things, and that's the whole point behind it is, you get called a shill, we get called shills. So many of our friends who, again, like you said, it's quite simply, if you like something and don't automatically try to burn a couch in your front yard because, ooh, Star Wars made me mad, then you must be a shill. You must be on the payroll. I'm disappointed to say none of those checks have showed up yet, but we've had a lot of fun with making t-shirts and stickers to, make ourselves feel better.
That's awesome. I really like the idea of going through Star Wars as if it was a sacred text, and I'm curious how. I want to dig a little bit deeper into that because it feels like I know a lot of people that have gotten their how do I say it? Growing up, they learned about morality and good and evil, and got role models and stuff from fictional characters, from their love of comic books, from Star Wars. And I'm curious, how do you think, do you think that's the right way to do it? Do you think there's any benefits or drawbacks from that? And what have you seen, especially from Star Wars?
I think it's a very subjective thing. Obviously, I live in the deep South, and, conservative Christianity is a huge part of the culture and the part of the country that I live in. There are people of different faiths all over the world who love Star Wars. And one of the things that, if you spend any time studying religion, whether you have a personal faith or not, George Lucas himself built a lot of Star Wars around a lot of the world religions. You see Christianity, you see Buddhism, you see, Shintoism, you see all these different aspects of religion built into it. you also see that in almost every narrative thing that has existed, from the beginning of time. Because if you look at, I had a class in college where they kind of did a similar version of what we tried to do with Podcast of the Whills, but as a discussion based college course at a liberal arts college, they said, we want you to look at the Bible not as a spiritual and sacred text, but as a work of literature, and have discussions based on what you read in this book that so many of us have just been conditioned from birth to go, oh, that's a holy text. That's something different. To look at it through the eyes of, what if this is just a work of literature? What are these stories like? Because we read, like in Origins, in Genesis, we read the origin story. There's 2 different origin stories in the book of Genesis about Adam and Eve. We read origin stories from other cultures, whether it's Native American, African culture. You read those stories, and if that's not your faith tradition, you kind of read it like you're reading a fairy tale. Somebody who's not a Christian may read stories in the book of Genesis and go, oh, that's a cool tale. It's a fable, it's a whatever. We've grown up, whether it's with fairy tales, whether it's Grimm's, Hans Christian Andersen, anything like that, we've gotten morality tales in works of fiction. If you're a little kid who grew up in the 80s watching cartoons on Saturday morning, you got it from Captain Planet and Tom and Jerry and Bugs Bunny. Like, none of that is foreign, and Star Wars is certainly, the next in a long line of places where those stories come from. Whether it's good or bad, I mean, I think that's subjective in, the environment you're raised in, because some people, the only access they may have to morality is through whatever their culture they're, given, whether it's media, comic books, TV. Some people have absentee parents. They don't have role model figures in their life that can say, hey, you probably shouldn't do that. So we should be thankful, I think, that there are some media forms that are out there. Now, we hope that the right media forms get in front of the right people. If you have somebody who doesn't have a role model in their life and the only thing they get to watch is, I don't know, Jackass or, Beavis and Butthead or something like that, like, there could be a problem along the way, and they're going to get, shifted off the path. I think it's really special, and it's always been something that has spoken to me because everybody hears and receives messages differently. I may be predisposed to something like science fiction or fantasy, where somebody else might be more science and logic based and want to read, a Greek philosophy book or, something along those lines. So to me, it's a good thing because it creates other ways. And if nothing else, it creates ways to reinforce what you may have learned somewhere else. If you grew up in, a Christian church tradition and you had Sunday school stories about, Moses, leading the Israelites out of Egypt, and then you watch, Ahsoka and you see Ezra in his Charlton Heston, Moses looking gear standing on top of that thing as they're making their way out of this planet, you go, it clicks, it reinforces something. So to me,
well,
there's
now
a
I
lot
just
of
want to see
power.
him with his little turtle minions, and he's like, let my people go.
Exactly. I think, and I'm sure I wasn't the only one to do it, but that shot, like the costuming, even, he's got the red and the little overcloak.
Yeah.
There were some definite ties and connections there, but yeah, I think it's a good thing. And I think personally, I like it when we as a culture and we as a people have the ability to draw inspiration from a lot of different places. I think that makes us better people. I think we should learn about different cultures, whether it's, real world cultures in the world we live in, whether it's, I'm not a Lord of the Rings guy. I've tried, but I appreciate, the stories and the things that come out of that. I appreciate the real world stories of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis hanging out together, in a pub back in the time when they're all writing stories and writing books and, spending time together, in the real world history that comes with that. So to me, and I think I've maybe gotten us far away from your original question, but I think it's an important thing. I think it's an important thing that we have these kinds of options to teach us things like morality, because not everyone is going to be a part of a faith tradition. Not everybody's going to have, like I said, strong role models. They may have parents, but those parents are working hard to keep the lights on and keep the bills paid. They may not have as much time to spend with them, to mentor them. So if Star Wars is something that can help show you good and bad and teach you lessons like there's more of us and, don't fight the thing you hate, save the thing you love, like, that's a good thing. That's a win in most every category.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of people who just don't have access to it. Like I personally have met quite a few people who were like army brats, and so they lived in a different part of the world where they weren't surrounded by anything, and all they had access to was old movies and comics and stuff like that, and that's kind of how they gathered it. But it's an interesting idea because this is kind of what George intended. Like,
right.
Storytelling as an oral tradition has always had this purpose. There were always morality tales. That's what these I mean, they call them old wives' tales, for
Right.
a reason, and they would teach lessons to the kids growing up. And basically, George grabbed as many of these as he could, drew a big circle around all of them, and figured out what the common denominator was, and made
Right.
Star Wars. Star Wars
And he
isn't
did it-
special because it's unique. It's special because it's kind of the opposite
That's
of
right.
unique. It's
And
everything.
he did it at a time too where you had things like Vietnam going on that are coming out of Vietnam, was able to also teach younger kids some of these lessons, because our parents and our people who were coming back from Vietnam, again, they were in that place. They weren't necessarily in a headspace to be parents. They were in a headspace to deal with the trauma of coming home from war, reinstituting their life, figuring out what's going on. And George Lucas had the ability to go, he's famously said a bunch of times, it's a story about space wizards for children. But the thing is, it tells very strict, specific morality tales, teaching lessons about, you can draw it to Hitler, you can draw it to Vietnam, you can draw it to so many other places, that whether
Richard
he
Nixon.
sat down and, Nixon, whether he sat down and went, I'm going to teach these kids a school lesson, he didn't. But at the same time, all of those things are baked into it layer by layer, and it spoke to that very specific generation. Which I think, and I just saw somebody post this the other day, so I can't claim it as my own original thought, but it's been rolling around in my head. The generation that grew up with the original Star Wars were the kids of people who came home from Vietnam and were going through that time in the 70s up through the early 80s, and had a lot of trouble with change, which is probably why the prequels were received by that generation the way they were, because of the time that they came out of, the time they grew up in, had more of a direct impact on it than simply, ooh, I don't like this movie.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's been such a transformative work, but and we just hit, what is this, the 47th anniversary,
yes,
as we're recording this, and yeah, it stands the test of time, and the amount of people we've been able to connect with, us included, especially over this pandemic, has been insane. I'm curious. So, how exactly did you get started into Star Wars? What was your induction like? And how has it? Did it affect your trajectory or affect your life?
I was born in 1978, so I was born just a tiny touch behind 77 when it came out. Would have been just a tiny bit too young. I did see Return of the Jedi at a drive-in movie theater in Central Illinois, where we lived at the time. Other than that, seeing the other ones, they were on recorded beta and VHS tapes off of HBO back when it ran on HBO originally back in the day. Somehow my dad got copies of those recorded, and I wore those tapes out. I mean, I watched them every chance I got to the point where they got
Betamax, by the way.
Exactly. It wore them out to the point where they got squiggly. And by the time we got to the late 80s, early 90s, and they started selling box sets, that was my savior, because I had already basically worn out the tapes that I had. So I had the movies early on, saw Jedi in the drive-in movie theater in my parents' station wagon, that I grew up with it. There's never been a time in my life where I haven't had Star Wars. And so, of course, seeing it that young, it sparked my imagination. It was what I wanted to play. That and Indiana Jones, those were the two things that I played all growing up. If I wasn't outside, trying to steal an idol or, escape with the treasure and run from Nazis, I was pushing the end of my twin-size bed off to make it look like an X-Wing so I could fight space Nazis. Like, it was one of these, it was a part of my play. It was a part of growing up. As I got older and I got into middle school, it became, the old expanded universe novels, because that was the Star Wars that we had. I was never really a comic books guy. Didn't have any issues with them. I just never had them, so I never read them. But I did read the novels. My dad introduced me to a lot of this stuff, and he is still a sci-fi guy. So he would have the books, or he'd go buy them and read them, and then I'd read them when he got done. So, original Thrawn trilogy, Jedi Academy trilogy, a bunch of those were just those key focal points for me until we got re-releases, we got special editions, and then, fast forward into the prequels. I was in college when Phantom Menace came out, which was now 25 years ago. And so it's always been around. I'm sure I went through that normal period at some point. I saw the prequels when I was in college, or some of them came out after I graduated. Actually, 2 of the 3 came out
How'd you
after I
feel about it when they
graduated.
came out?
I didn't like them. I was one of those guys. I wasn't completely one of those guys. I wasn't like rude and gross about it, but I just went, I don't like that. I said that's not my Star Wars. That was that was as far of the line as I was willing to push, because, expectation does something to you. We see that a lot now in the current space that we're in. Every time we get a Disney Plus trailer, every time somebody goes, that's not what I thought it was going to be. Well, guess what? They're not making it just for me. They're making it for everybody. So it's not going to be just what I want it to be. But when I was 19 and 20 years old, I wasn't wise enough necessarily to have sorted all of that out. So I didn't hate him, but I just didn't care for him. I just went, I'll keep the other 3. That was just and I think I was more in the headspace then of where I wish more of the hateful people were now, which was, if you don't like it, don't watch it. Like, I watched them when they came out a bunch of times, and then I didn't watch them for like 5 or 6 years because I went, I don't really like it. So I just kept watching the ones I did like. But I have very much come around to all of those movies. I enjoy them. I recognize the place that they play. I do think wisdom and age and maturity has a lot to do with that. Being, the bad side that we all see on social media is even more of a reason for me to go, really? That's what you're mad about? Like, come on, screws and bricks in Star Wars? What are we talking about? But yeah, I love those movies. I love the sequel movies. It's Star Wars. And guess what? If I don't like it, I don't have to watch it. I'm not owed anything. And, there have been things that I like less than other things. I've tried to watch Star Wars Resistance 3 times. I haven't made it past the 2nd episode yet. I'm sure it's great. I know a million people love it. It just hasn't grabbed me, but I'm not mad about it. I'm not screaming how Lucasfilm is wrong and why didn't they make it so that I could enjoy it. I love Star Wars Rebels. That wasn't written for people my age. I was one of the outliers that I look at it and go, this is one of the best Star Wars stories that I think has been told, certainly since the Disney acquisition. I love Star Wars Rebels. It's hard to explain, but again, every story hits everybody a different way. And the reality is, if you don't like it, you don't have to be there. I've said for a long time, it's like a restaurant. You go to a restaurant, you have a bad experience. Instead of just not going to that restaurant again, people keep going back to that restaurant and paying for the food just so they can yell about how they don't like it. It doesn't make sense. Why are you doing that?
Yeah, it's funny because there was the Zack Snyder movie Rebel Moon that was coming out. It was supposed to be like the Star Wars killer or whatever. I don't know, but I watched part 1 and it was a little rough. And then part 2 came out, I want to say a month ago, something like that. It's fairly recent. And
haven't watched it yet.
Neither have I. I actually made a video asking people, like, how was it? I wasn't planning to watch it, but I was hoping, at least hoping enough people would be like, no, it's so much better or whatever. You got to give it a second chance. And no. And so
I'm exactly the same way. Watched the first one. I was like, this is being hyped up. Let's check it out. Watched the whole thing. Kept checking to see how much more was left because I was going, really? I don't know how much. I got to get there. The most compelling character to me was the robot, and we know how that turned out.
The robot was fantastic.
Exactly. And, didn't get to stick around. And then the second one's been out, and I have not even pretended to watch the second one.
Yeah,
So I understand. But again, I'm not out there screaming I was robbed. I'm not out there screaming, I can't believe they promised me grown-up angry Star Wars, and I didn't get it.
Yeah. But my hot take is that, especially lately, I feel like the writing in Star Wars projects has just been, the writing and character work has just been through the roof. You know what I mean? Even if, like we just got done with Bad Batch. Bad Batch, I mean, I think Clone Wars is a more entertaining show, like when it's with its highs. It does have some pretty low lows, in my opinion, but it's high. The highs are really high. But pound for pound, character work, Bad Batch blows it out of the water. It's crazy.
It really does. And I think you're right. It has continued to develop and get better, because when Clone Wars Season 7 came out, those first 4 episodes of that 4 episode arc, the first 4 was Bad Batch. And I watched it and I went, okay, whatever. Didn't really care. Didn't really take my meter. The middle part with the Martez sisters, fine. Didn't really take my meter. I was there for those last four with Ahsoka and Maul, and how that whole thing wrapped up. But by the time Bad Batch premiered, that first season, that first episode, I was in hook, line, and sinker because the writing of those characters had progressed even that much more. And it's something else too, that as Star Wars fans, and really as any kind of genre fan, we are so lucky that we have Lucasfilm Animation, because the amount of stuff that they are doing that is so phenomenally good, from, like you said, a storytelling and character development point, but even like visually, like that medium continues to blow me away. The music that the Kiner brothers have been doing over these last series, it's cinematic in a way that we look at from movies. I catch myself in Bad Batch looking at the scenery and being awed by how cool it looks. And I'm like, wait, this is animation. And it's beautiful and it's amazing and it's art. And I think that's same thing with Visions, to create these other avenues to explore developing characters. You watch those shorts from these different countries and these different storytellers from different cultures, and it does the same thing. It develops characters that, you watch half of those Vision shorts and you're like, all right, I need an entire series of that because I want to know even more, about those two kids in the, space Indian village. I want to know more about, the guy in the Jabba the Hutt emo rock band. Like, I want to learn, those stories.
Absolutely need a continuation of that story more than anything. But yeah, I really do feel like that's kind of like what I kind of see as the split in the fandom is I can watch Visions and be thrilled at seeing how other cultures and other people, how they view Star Wars, what it means to them, and like with the art that they create with it. And I think that's amazing. Like, I would have never thought to do this,
Right.
And that's like spectacular versus only wanting to see the same thing or the same characters or the same type of story over and over again. If you were given the green light to make your own project, whether it was canon or not canon, or doesn't even matter the medium, right? If it's video games, whatever, what would you green light?
I think I had this conversation with somebody just the other day, and I think the answer that I gave, because of course it could change depending on what I'm watching, what I'm reading, what I'm obsessed with at the moment. I think the thing I would want right now would be a Clone Wars style animated show that focuses on the original trilogy characters in the, let's call it, between Empire to after Return of the Jedi. Like some more of those in between stories. Chase after Han, all of those different aspects, building the rebellion, the continual chases, from Vader. I think that, of course, we've lost some of these actors. There's a mixed bag when it comes to some of the CGI and the, character stuff. It doesn't have to be a live action thing. You could do some really killer Clone Wars style animation and get, if Mark Hamill wants to come and they use a processor to, take some of the deep age out of his voice and he can still be Luke, great. But you can get people like Shelby and AJ to come in and do, Han and Leia and, Lando and whoever, and tell some more of those stories. And I think seeing those kinds of stories and that style of animation would be really cool, and would also kind of give a sort of Saturday morning cartoon vibe, but really for grown-ups that, we grew up with cartoons in the 80s, but the Droids cartoons didn't look like the Clone Wars cartoons.
That's true. You mean Caravan of Courage didn't quite do it for you?
It's not the same. It's just really not. For all of the, for all of the Wilford Brimley of it, just not quite the same.
And you know what? I mean, that was George's original idea. He wanted something, because he grew up with the pirate serials and the cowboy serials and, and the space ones and stuff like that. And he wanted, the next generation of kids to be able to experience that. And I think that would be actually a really cool thing to do.
And you can serialize it in that way.
My specific idea is similar to yours. What I would absolutely love to see, and they wouldn't do this because it would potentially step on toes of future projects, but I would love to see Rey starting her own Jedi school and her teaching lessons. And when she has a question or what, she has to go to the ancient texts and she sees Luke's notes in there, and then it's a flashback. And so it's actually Luke's stories and what Luke went through to learn this specific lesson, but that lesson being carried forward for Rey into the future for her Jedi school.
I love that. And we've seen the idea floated of, when the Lando thing was going to be a series, maybe it was Billy D, sitting back in a cape with a glass of, cognac somewhere going, I remember the time and then it cuts to young Lando.
Donald Glover doing something.
Yeah, Donald Glover out telling the story, doing the adventure. Same thing. One of the books, one of my kids had it and it ended up on my bookshelf. But I think it was like The Adventures of Luke Skywalker or something. And the framing mechanism of the book is like kids on like a pirate ship or something. They're sitting on deck telling stories about Luke Skywalker.
Yeah.
And each chapter is a different, like, oh, one time Luke Skywalker did this. And then it jumps into the story of another one of those adventures. So exactly like what you're talking about. I think that would absolutely work.
Yeah. And it even kind of goes into something that Dave Filoni said, or at least we heard Dave Filoni said secondhand, that the way he views Star Wars is kind of like campfire tales, and one person may tell you the tale and it might be a little bit different than when that person tells you it. And that's why he has varied things like lightsaber color and stuff like that. Which is an interesting way to look at it.
Sorry. I've also heard the of course there was controversy when Disney bought Lucasfilm and kind of the decanonization of, the old EU and the line between Legends and Canon and that kind of thing. I heard somebody also describe the Legends books in a similar way. The Legends stories are the stories you heard told around the campfire. Yeah, I've heard of Grand Admiral Thrawn. He, did this and had a bodyguard that did this. And did you ever hear about Jedi Master Sabaoth or whatever his name is? Like, those could have been other campfire stories because everybody's like, well, there really is a Thrawn. So again, it's just framing. That's really all it is. And if you're, if you're so worked up about this fake thing,
I like to say it's AO3 in Star Wars. That's what Legends is.
Yep.
That's why Luke is always like hooking up with like weird computer program ladies.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. He's in love with the computer lady.
Yeah, and how he has like a redheaded supermodel wife and all this stuff. Like,
correct.
I don't know, it just makes more sense that's like so.
But at the same time, she's not really anything, so she's kind of like his girlfriend from Canada. She doesn't go here. She goes to a different school.
It's a story that like Luke wrote himself under a pen.
Correct.
And,
yeah,
like posted.
Just blowing it up, making it bigger.
All right, go a couple quick hits here. So, Old Republic or High Republic?
Old Republic, because, and actually that's a really unfair question because I'm dangerously not conversant in both of those. I do feel like I have a tiny bit more knowledge of the Old Republic simply from video games and some of that kind of stuff, but I admire the High Republic. I have not taken the time. I haven't read the books. I'm so excited for the Acolyte. I really am. I'm hoping maybe that's the thing that gives me my push. I think when my bandwidth up top in my brain gets overloaded, the thought of starting an entire new million book series and then verging into an entire new part of Star Wars, like, I just don't think I have the RAM for it at the moment. I have a wife, 4 daughters, 2 dogs, 2 turtles, a job, like 5 different podcasts apparently. Like, at some point I had to let something go, and for the moment High Republic is that. And people keep saying audiobooks, and of course we love Mark Thompson. But my thing with audiobooks is I'm a multitasker, and if I listen to an audiobook and I'm doing something else, I'll look up 20 minutes later and realize I haven't really been listening. And then I have to go back and re-listen again because I've missed salient details and plot points. So for me, a good old-fashioned book in the hand is still my preferred way to consume a book. But if I'm going to do that, it's usually at night and I'm in bed. And if I put a book in front of my face when I'm in bed, it's not going to take very long before I'm just done. So I would love to get to High Republic at some point, and I'm sure that I will. But for the time being, if I'm picking, I'm going Old Republic because of video games.
Okay. No, that's fair. All right. Prequels or sequels?
That is a tougher question. I'm going to go sequels, and I'm going to go sequels for a very specific one. The Last Jedi. I will preach the good and glory of The Last Jedi until I fall off of my stool for the last time. I love the prequels. I love Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan. I love so many of the things that have come out of those movies. The real life story of Ahmed Best and what he's gone through and the return that he's gotten to have in Star Wars. Hayden, the same thing. Hearing the story from Clayton Sandell recently about Jake Lloyd. There's so much good in those. And of course, I enjoy and love those movies. But if I'm going to pick one, I'm going to go sequels because not only does it weave in some of the threads of the stuff that I love the most from a kid, I still get some more Han Solo, some Carrie Fisher, but The Last Jedi to me is something special. And, people like to play ranking games and I can take them or leave them. But I have said for a long time, my favorite Star Wars is Empire Strikes Back, but it is my opinion that The Last Jedi is the best Star Wars. So if I'm picking favorite and best, that's how they break down.
I'm inclined to agree. I actually swapped them, but yeah, no, that's my favorite and opinion of best. All right, special editions or original?
Original for sure. I grew up with the originals. On shot first. That's just the way it is. And it's a tough thing because the special editions, there's some really great stuff in there, but it's kind of like a chef who keeps messing with the food till you mess with a point. Like you went and put a little too much salt in and you can't take it back out. Like fixing the A-pillars in the snow speeders in Empire so you couldn't see the walker through them as they're flying by, like shoring up some of those visual effects. Like that's a great use of the special editions. Adding McClunky, adding Greedo shooting first, adding Jabba.
McClunky was a good idea.
Yeah, adding Jabba to the scene in the hangar, unnecessary. Don't need it. In fact, in my opinion, from a story standpoint, it weakens Jabba the Hutt for Return of the Jedi that we see him as a slimy, slipping around worm that Han Solo's brash enough to step on his tail. I know why they did it. They did it because of the practical effect, but it makes Jabba the weaker so that instead of you get to Return of the Jedi and you're like, oh, this is that big scary mob boss we've heard about. It's the slimy worm guy. He stepped on his tail before. He can't be that scary. Nobody was stepping on Tony Soprano's feet as a joke while they were talking about the money he owed him. You didn't do that. He was a scary dude. I think original trilogy is definitely
not
my
to
pick.
mention because there's several versions and iterations of changes, but correct. I remember the first iteration. The animation of him stepping off the tail was chunky.
It was so clunky.
Rough. It was, yeah.
It wasn't good at all. But
although I will say, Empire Strikes Back, pound for pound, I feel like if you isolate just that one movie, far better with the changes.
Correct. Because it did the least in the way of like, it didn't change the narrative. It didn't add story points. It was all visual stuff. You fix the snow stuff. You give Bespin this more beautiful, the Cloud City fly through. Even
just having windows in Cloud City.
Yeah, seeing the people moving in the wind, and same thing with New Hope, like coming through the streets of Tatooine. Like I could live without the droid knocking the guy on the ground,
or the big dinosaur just walking across the frame.
Correct. The big Ronto, for everybody that's eating Ronto wraps at Galaxy's Edge, that's what that big dinosaur is. Popping up, down, dropping stuff on the ground. I didn't need the slapstick part of it, but the visual effects of getting to see this street and this busy, or like you said, Cloud City, just getting to actually visually. Honestly, it gives me a lot of the feels for Ralph McQuarrie, which I love Ralph McQuarrie art, and I'm such a sucker for behind the scenes stuff. I talk about that too much all the time. But those beautiful Ralph McQuarrie matte paintings and the concept art, like that's what they were able to do, certainly with Empire in those special editions, was flesh out that place even more so that you could see what was intended as the vision.
I mean, Ralph McQuarrie is why I love Rebels so much, because that's specifically his art. And I actually struggled with Clone Wars style art. To me, it's still really tall and angular and kind of funky looking. But if it's what you grew up with, it's what you grew up with. You know what I mean?
That's right. Yeah, that has grown on me over time as well. And I've said many times, and so if anybody that's listening to this has heard me say it before, I was just old enough that I didn't watch Clone Wars when it came out. I was already out of college. I was working. I was kind of in that in-between time of coming back to Star Wars through the movies and whatever. But by the time I got to Rebels, I almost used Clone Wars like a reference book. Like every time something came up, I was like, I need to learn more about that. And I'd go look it up online. There's 3 episodes about Mortis. Oh, there's 4 episodes about this thing. And so I consumed Clone Wars in little chunks to figure out what have I been missing out on? What does this refer to? And over the course of doing that, came to appreciate it. But even early on, I was just like, this is kind of obnoxious. Like, this isn't necessarily what I want. But then again, as the medium continues to develop and, the textures in the animation, certainly by the time we're getting to Bad Batch and Clone Wars Season 7, that chalk paint look that they have on their helmets, and just so much of it, even if it's not my favorite style, is certainly an art form that I can appreciate.
Yeah, I see. I'm of the age group who was jaded about that specifically, right? Because everyone
Mm-hmm.
has to be jaded of something
Of
that's,
something.
when I was coming up, it was, I mean, I'd seen, the originals, but when I really got into Star Wars was, I mean, I had an old VHS tape of Empire. That was the,
Mm-hmm.
the original cut, but it was when the
Yep.
special editions that were coming out that was my formative introduction, which bled into the prequels. But then once
Yeah.
Clone Wars came out, the Clone Wars was my prequels of like, this isn't
Mm-hmm.
what it looked like. Anakin didn't have a Padawan. What is this? Um, and I still hate Zero the Hutt, but that's a whole separate thing. No, it's interesting how that always kind of shakes out. Okay, so Yub Nub or Victory Celebration?
All right. I always get this wrong, and last time I did this, Yub Nub is the original, right? What's the
Yes.
original? Yes, Yub
Yeah,
Nub.
it's
That's
Yub
where I
Nub.
am. Yep, Yub Nub for sure.
Okay.
Same thing with
Jedi
Loptinet versus
Rocks.
Jedi Rocks. Yep,
Okay.
original. Got to
All
go
right,
original.
fair enough. All right. Let's see here.
Something else I didn't need in the special editions was the overextended dance video remix in Jabba's palace.
I don't know, man. That jizz goes hard, or jats. Jats,
That's
as
it.
we
Yeah,
say nowadays.
depending on
So, who in Star Wars do you wish you were, and who actually are you?
This is a good one. Of course, growing up, I wished I was Han Solo. Same way I wished I was Indiana Jones. They didn't have magic powers. Luke Skywalker had magic powers, seemingly. Han Solo and Indiana Jones were regular dudes who messed up, and sometimes it worked out. They got by on their charm and, sharp wits and that kind of thing. So that's who I always wanted to be. Always wanted to be Han Solo. Who I actually am, tough. I don't know if I like this answer, but I might be Uncle Owen, because he was a practical minded man. Like, he was saying, you're not going to do that. That's a bad idea. And I'm a dad, and I've got 4 daughters. And so I spend a lot of time going, don't do that. That's a bad idea. And I know because I've had experience, but I also am supposed to let you go and experience things on your own. I want to be the Obi-Wan. I want to be the one that's wise and teaches you things. But I think I'm probably the overprotective Uncle Owen, if I'm being realistic with myself.
No. Like you protected his father.
Exactly. See, I'm gonna fail somewhere.
No, I love it. Like I want myself to be the Obi-Wan, but I feel like I'm more of an R2D2, which is not a bad thing, but it's certainly less thrilling. I don't know.
I don't know about that, and R2D2 I have maintained for many, many years is my favorite character in Star Wars. I may want to be Han Solo, but if you're saying who's your favorite character, I'm picking R2D2. I think there's a lot of beauty in the fact that he's consistent, he's there, and I love that they were able throughout the story to have him there at the beginning, there at the end. The shots of, 2 of the things that I've done, I've been rewatching the sequels over this weekend because Pete and I are doing a big, huge sequels revisited stream tomorrow evening. And so I've been trying to get, just get them as fresh as I can to talk about them. And I remember in Last Jedi when Luke sneaks on the Falcon and he's talking to R2 and he's like, I can't go back. When R2 plays that video of Leia from New Hope, I'm just like, God, like, that's so good. But then even more in Rise, when Leia dies, to have R2 there, to be there at the beginning, to be there at the end. One of my favorite books when I was in college, and still is Ender's Game, the first original Ender's Game.
Okay, yeah.
And I loved that they had the concept in Ender's Game of the speaker for the dead. And this was the person that when you died was going to speak on your behalf, tell your story, pass along whatever it is, not necessarily a eulogist, but, a more noble version of, who's going to speak for you. The intentional focus on the fact that R2's memory banks were never wiped. And he has carried this entire saga, this entire story, from beginning to end. He is the speaker for the dead. He's the one who is going to continue to communicate this message. And so I hope that there is some sort of role for him in whatever future project we're going to get, through the Rey movie, if it's an Academy, if he's there sharing those stories, kind of like what you're talking about. But yeah, R2D2 is, a very special character as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Yeah. I love it. I love it. All right. Is there that's most of the questions that I had for you that I was going to I really want to answer. But is there anything specific that you wanted to share or that you want people to know?
Oh, man, what do I want people to know? Star Wars is fun. Star Wars is supposed to be fun. Star Wars is supposed to be something that brings people together. You and I have had conversations both when you've been on our shows, when I've watched some of the stuff that you've tweeted about, talked about in your streams. There is negativity out there. The reality is there's not nearly as much as there are people who straight up just love Star Wars. I think another one of those great moments in Rise is when all the ships show up, and I think it's Lando says, there's more of us. That's the reality in Star Wars fandom. That's the reality in any fandom, to be honest. You think about all the noise that we hear on social media. You think about, the grifters, the people that are literally doing this for money and getting clicks and that kind of thing. You think about that, and that's all we hear because we are all, sickeningly online most of the time, spending all of our free time. But when we step out into the real world, and this isn't supposed to be a go touch grass kind of thing, but if you step out into the real world and go to a local Comic-Con or a regional Comic-Con or go to Star Wars Celebration, you know what you're not going to see there? All those people pitching a fit about Star Wars. You're going to see 60,000 people excited to get to be together, excited to talk about Star Wars, excited to, spend time together. It's nerd family reunion. Like, what else? It's bigger than some people being mad online. My thing is enjoy what you enjoy. If you don't like it, that's okay. There's a lot more out there and there's a lot more coming. And at the same time, the other thing that we talk about on our channel all the time is you're allowed to not like something. You're just not allowed to be an asshole about it. Like, that's really what it comes down to. If you don't like it, that's great. That's what critique is. That's, we're allowed to talk about things and go, this is where I disagree. But you don't have to tell somebody you're a terrible human being, or women ruin Star Wars, or, George Lucas is going to buy it back and restart all the trilogies. Like, what are we talking about here, folks? It's fun, and it should continue to be fun.
I'm glad you say that and say it like that, because I myself have I've looked back at like some of my older videos, and then like I realized, like, man, like some of the negativity and stuff out there has truly gotten to me, and it's made me kind of slow down on my content, because I was like, if I'm not enjoying it, if I don't have joy to put out there, I'm just adding to the noise, So
that's right. And it's a tough thing, because we find ourselves wanting to, sometimes we want to engage, but I think we have to be careful to pick where we engage. And I think that's the other thing. There are certain people who have theories about Star Wars. They don't need us to engage with them. They don't need us to talk about why they're complaining about this thing. There are other people who just want to be mad that there are women in Star Wars. They don't need us to talk about why that's a dumb take. We all get that. I think the thing to remember is there is a time for us to show up and step up. And I think when somebody's being racist, when they're being sexist, when they're being exclusionary, those are the times when we as a Star Wars community come together. We saw it during the Obi-Wan stuff with, Ewan McGregor's in his car making a video, in defense of, I'm sorry, Reva, what's her name? The actress's name?
Moses Ingram.
Yeah, Moses Ingram. In those situations, that's the time to step up. That's the time for somebody, for a content creator who has a voice and who has a platform, to be able to go, yeah, I don't think so. I'm throwing a flag on that, because that's not what Star Wars is. That's not who we are. But the nonsense, the knucklehead stuff, it's better just to go, really? That's what you're mad about? Okay, cool. I'm going to go watch another Star Wars and move on.
Yeah. Okay. There was one more question I was going to ask you. It feels inconsequential after what we just spoke. But all right, when you hear Obi-Wan Kenobi, who do you picture?
Gosh, that's tough. I think it's Ewan at this point. I really do. I mean, I love Alec Guinness, but we got such a short amount of Alec Guinness compared to the amount of Ewan that we've gotten. I also have moments when I'm at just the right age, and if my hair's grown out just the right amount, that I have a little bit of a Ewan Obi-Wan thing going on. So if I was
All
ever going
right.
to cosplay, there's not enough good beards in Star Wars. So usually I said I had to be somebody with a helmet, but I could probably pull off like a Clone Wars Obi-Wan with the armor. Like that's the one I want. But yeah, we've had enough Ewan Obi-Wan at this point. I think that's who I see.
You know what? You got. I think you got the coloring in there that you could probably do a callus. If you grow out the chops a bit.
Get the chops right there.
Yeah. That's what I want to see.
Totally works. I'll take either one.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me for having this conversation.
My
Again,
pleasure.
if you want to shout out your many projects so people can check you out.
Absolutely. Honestly, the easiest thing to do is go to the sswnetwork.com. That's where you can find Around the Galaxy, ATG Live, Podcast of the Whills. We've still got links to Podathon up there. I am chronically online. Most of the time it's on Twitter. I will not call it the other thing. It's still Twitter, always will be. And until they literally unplug it, I'll probably still be there just because it seems like, despite all the other networks popping up, that's still where most people are. So if you want to find me on Twitter, I am at WhillsPod. That's WHILLSPOD. And yeah, that's it. Just love Star Wars, love hanging out, love getting to talk to folks like you.
All right. I appreciate it. And for everyone else, have a wonderful evening and may the force be with you always.
Always.